All right, here is your first video review on natural selection. Remember, we started this with 3 interesting stories about a bird, a bacteria, and a moth, and how they changed over time. So the story of that peppered moth, and for this you should refer to page 1 of your handout, of your practice test. Sorry, yeah, is it page 1? Yes, page 1 of your practice test, questions 3 and 4. So just to recap with the moth, in 1850, the speckled form of the moth was the predominant form. There was variation. There was a black one too, but it was really rare. And but what was surprising was, been 50 years later, they were almost all black, and now the speckled one was rare, and that had not been seen before. And then another 100 years later, and we're back to the speckled. And just to give you a sense of what's going on with this moth, they're nocturnal, so they're very active at night. During the day, they rest, and they rest on the trunks of trees or on branches. And the trees tend to be kind of an ashy brown color. So, and sometimes there's different lichen and things growing on the tree. So this actually blends in perfectly with the native trees in England where it lives. The black one really stands out against that tree trunk, and so they tend to get eaten quite quickly. However, what was happening at this time? Well, humans were developing, and it was the Industrial Revolution, so we had all kinds of energy being used and developed, and there was a tremendous amount of pollution. It's hard to imagine what it was like back then. We continue to get better at filtering out a lot of the contaminants from burning fossil fuels. Back then, they were not good at filtering these things. And so basically, the trees in the area were covered with soot, with ash. And so the tree trunks darkened. As the tree trunks darkened, that provided an advantage to this dark form of the moth. So now, during the day when it's resting and birds want to come along and eat it, these black ones are blending in beautifully. The speckled ones are standing out dramatically, and those are the ones that the birds would eat. Okay? What's happening today's time? Why are they back? Well, we've gotten better at keeping things clean. So now the trees are going back to their normal form. They're back in their normal color, the tree trunks. They're no longer covered with soot from pollution, from burning fossil fuels. And so now the moth population has gone back to having mostly speckled, and the dark form is rare. Bacteria. And so we know this bacteria was first identified by people in the 1880s. It's mostly a harmless bacteria. But in 1940, there are other forms of bacteria that are not harmless. And penicillin was used to treat the harmful forms of bacteria. 2 years later, we discovered this bacteria that was resistant to penicillin. Another drug was introduced a little bit later, methicillin, and that also was killing off the bacteria. It was quite effective. Another 2 years later, or 1 year later, we're discovering that everything is resistant to the penicillin. So what do you think is going to happen with methicillin? Well, it's just a matter of time. Now we're seeing bacteria that is resistant to methicillin. And then now methicillin doesn't really treat this very aggressive form or variety of this bacterium, and the infections are really difficult to treat. So here we see another population of organisms that are able to, the one who are most fit, they're able to resist whatever it is that's being brought into their environment. And then those that are able to resist reproduce. And if they're able to reproduce, they pass on the more like them come. And pretty soon the whole population has that trait that enables them to survive. Okay, and that one relates to question 5 in your practice test. All right, now we're over to the finches. So here we have Daphne major, Galapagos Islands, our male and female finches, right? And so what we're wondering here is, why did these finch beaks change over time, right? We saw that they did. So here we've got, in 1976, 9.2 millimeter beak. In 1978, 9.7 millimeter beak. And so in just 2 years' time, they changed. So what do we see here? Well, we see variation. So we see that in 1976, the average beak was 9.2, 78, the average is 1978. That shows that there is variation within a population. Not all finches have the same size beak. This just gives you background information about this area. We're gonna go ahead and skip through that for right now. So again, we've got our variation going on. Now let's look at the rainfall on Daphne Island. So this shows us that there was a drought. So in 75, this is our wet season, this is wet season, this is wet season, and this is wet season. That doesn't look very wet. So we can see that indeed there was a drought in 1977, and that is going to have an impact on the entire system. So what do we have here? This shows the y-axis shows the beak of the offspring, the x shows the beak of the parents, and the yellow represents 1976, and the triangle is 1978. And this red through line is a correlation, and it shows that as the beak of the parents got bigger, so did the beaks of the offspring. Okay? And I want you to also look at these circles. Look at how spread out the yellow circles are. You've got one all the way down here in 1976 and one all the way up there in 1976. So the variation in 1976 much greater than 1978. Wouldn't you agree? In 1978, we have the beak size being from here to this one. These are kind of outside the bell curve. Okay? All right, so now let's look at the impact here. So the orange shows you the numbers of finches that died during the drought. So you can see that the vast majority of the finch population died. The gray shows you who survived, the numbers that survived. And you can see the shift, right? So if you look at what was there, and now you can look at the bigger beak you had, the higher percentage chance you had to survive. So we didn't have that many finches with such a large beak size, but if they did have that beak size, at least 50% of them would survive. And then here, again, we didn't have that many with this size beak, but if you did have that, over 40% survived. No, 30 to 40%, yeah? Like somewhere in there. And here, 10.3, again, more individuals. You have 25 individuals surviving here. Out of about 110 or so. So over 25% survived here. Okay? So keep that in mind. The bigger your beak, the more likely you were able to break open those seeds and survive. But it's more than just that, right? Because if it was simply beak size, then 100% of these would have survived. So there's also other factors in play with the ability of the finch, the aggressiveness of the finch, the whole variety of factors, right? But beak size clearly mattered. All right, the main impact of this is what? The tremendous drop. You can see that within 1 year. So this shows your seasons, your years, and then it's divided by month. So, January, February, March, April, May, June, yeah. If you look at the first 5 months of the year, it's the wet season, and that's when the population should increase, because during the wet season is when you should increase. But in the dry season, the population decreases. And you can see these trends in 75 and in 77, but not in 76 because the wet season just never happened. So key thing here is when the population dropped. It dropped going into 1977. Yeah? Here you see the seed biomass, and it is mimicking the graph we just saw. So in that drought year, the seeds go straight down, just like here the finch population goes straight down. On this one, the y-axis shows that the higher the number, the harder the seed, and there are more harder seeds available because the little seeds were mostly all eaten. So that means the hardness index of how hard it is to crack open greatly increased because those little seeds were just taken up every bit as much as possible. So think about how to process this information. How would you put this together and how would you relate it to natural selection? So let's look at the finches and I'm going to look at the general scientific principles there. So within the finches, we saw that the beaks from baby finches changed from 9.2 in 76 to 9.7 in 78. We know that 77 was a drought year. We know that bigger beaks meant they were more likely to be able to eat seeds that were significantly bigger. These seeds happen to be 5 times bigger than the smaller, different variety of seeds. We know the big-beaked birds survived the drought better. We know the big-beaked parents have big-beaked babies. There were more big-beaked babies in 78 percentage-wise. Over time, the average beak gets bigger or thicker due to availability of resources. And this process is what Darwin termed natural selection. Nature selects on what traits and what individuals get to survive and get passed down. So let's look at the general scientific model. So when more individuals are born in a species than the environment can support, there is a struggle to survive. I should say born within a species and the environment can support. There's struggle to survive. Within every species, there's a naturally existing variation. More fit adaptations mean those individuals survive. In the case of the finches, more fit meant they had bigger beaks. Survivors get to reproduce, and these traits get passed to their offspring, and over time, the population shifts towards the favorable trait. Okay, that should give you full answers there for natural selection.